They actually tackled a sitting U.S. senator, and that's maybe not even the worst part about this. Kristi Noem, the Secretary of Homeland Security, just said the quiet part out loud, and that's not getting quite as much attention. Because at a federal press conference in Los Angeles, Kristi Noem stood behind a podium flanked by uniformed officers and declared that the military is in California to liberate it from its own elected leaders.
We are staying here to liberate this city.
Let that sink in. And to add extreme injury to insult, moments later, Senator Alex Padilla tried to ask a question, and what happened next was as horrific as it was predictable.
I have questions for the secretary.
Federal agents grabbed him, shoved him, and eventually handcuffed him face down on the floor. DHS is trying to retcon things by claiming that he lunged at Noem and failed to identify himself, even though this is all on video and he clearly says on camera,
I'm Senator Alex Padilla.
This is insane and it's horrifying, but let's talk about what the law actually says about this situation. So let's break this down. On June 12th, during a press conference at a federal building in Los Angeles, DHS Secretary Kristi Noem declared that the military is in California to liberate it.
We are not going away. We are staying here to liberate this city from the socialist and the burdensome leadership that this governor and that this mayor have placed on this country and what they have tried to insert into this city.
Now, in our other videos, we've talked about the Trump administration's putative legal justifications for sending in the National Guard and the Marines to Los Angeles. They say they need to repel a foreign invasion of migrants and stop a rebellion. That is, of course, nonsense. But Noem's remarks echoed what President Trump recently said when he spoke to troops at Fort Bragg.
Our country be destroyed by invasion and third world lawlessness here at home, like is happening in California.
Noem said that the federal military forces are in California to liberate the state from its elected leaders, including Governor Newsom and Mayor Karen Bass. And I think I'm underselling it when I say that this is startling and incendiary language from the sitting Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Now, a reporter who attended the news conference said in order to attend the briefing, they had to go through security. And the U.S. Senator from California, Alex Padilla, told the media that he was in the building to attend a military briefing when he heard about Noem's press conference. So he apparently entered the briefing room and tried to ask a question.
I have questions for the secretary, because the fact of the matter is a half a dozen violent criminals that you're rotating on your.
And Senator Padilla is the ranking member of the Senate Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Immigration, Citizenship, and Border Safety. And that subcommittee considers immigration reform proposals and has oversight over federal agencies with citizenship, asylum, refugee, and immigration enforcement responsibilities. So in sum, he's a guy that has a lot of legitimate questions for Secretary Noem. So in this part of the video, the agents pulled at his clothing and shoved him. He's speaking, but he does not appear to be resisting efforts to remove him. And of course, he starts off by very clearly identifying himself.
I'm Senator Alex Padilla.
A few seconds later, you can see what happened when they escorted Padilla out of the room. His hands were up, he did not touch or strike the officers. But here's how the Department of Homeland Security characterized what you just saw with your own eyes. Quote, Senator Padilla chose disrespectful political theater and interrupted a live press conference without identifying himself or having his Senate security pin on as he lunged toward Secretary Noem. Mr. Padilla was told repeatedly to back away and did not comply with officers' repeated commands. Secret Service thought he was an attacker and officers acted appropriately. Secretary Noem met with Senator Padilla after and held a 15-minute meeting. So let's unpack that. Do the facts stated by this government account match what you just saw on video? They say he did not identify himself, yet he clearly said, quote, I'm Senator Alex Padilla. I have questions for the secretary. So that part is clearly a lie. Now, you would expect the Secretary of DHS to know who Alex Padilla is, since she is conducting law enforcement operations in his particular state. Moreover, Senator Padilla is the top Democrat on the Subcommittee on Immigration, and Noem has met with that committee several times now. But the bigger point is that Padilla identified himself as a senator, and the administration has lied about it, even though it's clearly on video. So we can think about this in the context of how DHS is making similar allegations against Mayor Baraka in Newark, who they accused of storming an ICE facility. Now, the Justice Department eventually dropped the charges against him because he did not do what they alleged, and that was also confirmed by video. But I think George Orwell might have something to say about that. But DHS said Senator Padilla wasn't wearing his Senate security pin, making it hard for them to know who he was. But DHS also accused Padilla of lunging at Noem, as in physically threatening her. Now, I certainly don't see Padilla lunging at Noem in either of the two videos. And they said that they thought he was an attacker. Of course, Senator Padilla does not have a right to attack or attempt to assault Noam, but if he or anyone else tried to assault Noam, then he would have been wrong. But obviously that's not what the video shows. We also don't have video showing when Padilla entered the room, but I think that we can assume from the tone of his voice where he identifies himself as Senator Padilla that he probably wasn't particularly aggressive as he walked into the door. But it looks like when they dragged Padilla out of the room, Noam's voice was calm, she did not acknowledge him, and her posture didn't change. So common sense and our eyes probably don't support the assertion that he looked like an attacker. Padilla was in a room of heavily armed officers, he's a US senator, he's trying to ask her a question, and it's probably fair to characterize his voice as angry, but did anything about his body language indicate that he was trying to assault her? Probably not. And in fact, the other people on the podium didn't even react to Padilla or move to defend Noam. And yes, to add further insult to injury, they're saying that you are not allowed to record this horrible event.
There's no recording allowed out here.
DHS officers said that they told the senator repeatedly to back away, and he did not comply with the commands.
I also want to hands off.
How many of our ice agents have been docked?
On the ground. On the ground. Hands behind your back. Hands behind your back.
If you let my hands go and stand behind my back.
All right. Cool. One hand. Lay flat. Lay flat.
Other hand, sir. Other hand.
There's no recording allowed out here. I did not know. There's no recording allowed out here.
Now, based on this video, I'm not sure what commands he would have ignored. He's trying to get his questions out and they're shoving him backwards. And as many have pointed out, the men who pushed him backwards don't seem to be giving him any commands at the moment. Their mouths are shut. And we can cut back to the video. At this point, he lifts his right arm and touches the plainclothes officer in the chest while they're pulling him in the other direction. Is that resisting? It certainly doesn't look like a shove or anything like that. And a few seconds later, his hands are on one of the plainclothes officers while they're dragging him backwards. He does not appear to be trying to move forward. It's possible that he's trying to stay on his feet though, so I'd say it still doesn't qualify as resisting. And here's another view of it. This video is from a Padilla staffer.
I'm Senator Alex Padilla. I have questions for the secretary because the fact of the matter is a half a dozen violent criminals that you're rotating on your
When they get him into the other room, the officers, including some wearing uniforms, start grabbing his arms, and one appears to be pulling him to the left, another to the right, and a third officer is shoving him in back, moving him forward. And when law enforcement officers start to restrain or arrest someone, the person they're arresting rarely has the ability to stand completely still or lay completely still. In fact, it's often that police give contradictory commands, which will happen here. And when several officers are shoving and grabbing you, there will naturally be movement. And sometimes, as you saw there, the officers are tugging the person in different directions. And sometimes this creates the perception of resistance that may not exist. This is why in excessive force lawsuits, attorneys will question every officer on the scene in detail, asking them to identify each command they gave, every instance of the suspect's non-compliance, and to explain precisely how and why those actions constituted resistance. But there's one more video to look at. This is from Padilla's office, and it shows the officers handcuffing him. An officer says, "To the ground," and the senator kneels, and they say, "Hands behind your back," while shoving him forward onto the floor. And Padilla says something like, "I'm trying, you have to let go of them first."
On your back.
If you let my hands go and stand behind my back.
And then an officer says, "Lay flat," but you can see here that one officer is pushing down on his left hip, making it hard for him to go completely flat on his stomach. And as Senator Padilla noted when he said, "You have to let go of my hands," the officers can make it physically impossible for a person to comply with their commands. If an officer says, "Put your hands behind your back," but they're restraining your arms and hands, just the simple act of moving your arms to comply can make it appear as if you're resisting. And it happens all the time that officers tell people not to resist, and sometimes they yell, "Do not resist," to create a perception that the person must be resisting, which is itself a form of political theater. But it happens all the time, often in a time when the person cannot physically comply. This is something we talked about when the police arrested Miami Dolphins star Tyreek Hill. Not surprisingly, the police ended up dropping the charges against Hill as well. But afterwards, Senator Padilla spoke about what happened from his perspective.
At one point, I had a question, and so I began to ask a question. I was almost immediately forcibly removed from the room. I was forced to the ground, and I was handcuffed. I was not arrested. I was not detained.
Now, he said he wasn't detained, but I don't know what else you call that when you're being handcuffed and thrown to the ground. That's a detention. But of course, the devil is in the details. The officers will say that he didn't comply with their commands and he was going to charge the podium. Tricia McLaughlin, the Assistant Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, has already said as much. She said that Padilla was pushing and shoving law enforcement officers to get his way back up to the podium. Though, as Liz Dye noted during our video about the Baraka events, McLaughlin has a habit of stretching the truth, and that's putting it mildly.
McLaughlin then went on CNN to say, quote, "We actually have body camera footage of these members of Congress assaulting these ICE enforcement officers, including body slamming a female ICE officer. Is Bonnie Watson Coleman in the room with you now, Tricia? Blink twice if you're being body slammed."
This time around, McLaughlin said that no one knew who he was, despite the fact that Senator Padilla was in the building for a military briefing and clearly identified himself. But let's get to the law of this. U.S. senators, like all American citizens, enjoy the protections of the First Amendment, which guarantees the right to free speech. However, these rights are subject to reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, especially on government property. And the government can regulate speech in non-public forums, as long as the restrictions are content neutral, narrowly tailored, and leave open alternative channels for communication. For example, officials may lawfully restrict demonstrations, filming, or loud public statements in secure or non-public areas of a federal facility if doing so serves a legitimate purpose, such as safety or the uninterrupted functioning of government operations. But this was a press event with the press present. But Nome security detail treated Senator Padilla like an unruly citizen who got out of hand at a town hall, which sometimes can violate someone's rights. For example, in Heaney versus Roberts, the Fifth Circuit allowed a First Amendment claim to proceed after Tom Heaney was ejected from a city council meeting in Gretna, Louisiana. Heaney had been speaking about the legality of campaign contributions from no-bid contractors when Councilmember Roberts interrupted him and gave the floor to the city attorney. Although earlier speakers were allowed to finish, Roberts cut Heaney off and ordered a police officer to throw him out when he became agitated. The court found sufficient evidence that Heaney was silenced because of his viewpoint in a limited public forum and ruled the case could go to a jury. But there are some cases that go the other way. In Jones versus Heyman, for instance, the 11th Circuit held that the mayor of Key West did not violate any rights by removing a speaker who the mayor believed was repeatedly off topic or disruptive. The court said the mayor had a legitimate interest in controlling the agenda and preventing the disruption of the commission meeting. And there are also cases involving government removing media from news conferences. For example, in July 2021, citizen journalist Justin Pulliam, who runs the YouTube channel Corruption Report, was denied access to a sheriff's press conference in Fort Bend County, Texas. Sheriff Eric Fagan instructed deputies to keep Pulliam out, threatening to arrest if he tried to enter. A U.S. magistrate judge ruled that Pulliam's work was protected by the First Amendment, just like traditional journalists. The sheriff's actions violated Pulliam's free speech rights, and the violation was clearly established, meaning that the local officials should have known that they violated his rights. So it's definitely possible that Senator Padilla could file a lawsuit challenging his expulsion from the room and alleging false arrest. Now, if you're tackled and handcuffed for exercising your First Amendment right, you'll want a good lawyer. But if you want a great lawyer, my law firm, the Eagle Team, can help. If you've got in a car crash, suffered a data breach, especially if you've got a data breach letter saying your information might have been leaked, or dealing with a workers' comp or social security issue, we can represent you or help find you the right attorney. And by the way, we don't get paid unless you do, so there's nothing up front. So just click on the link in the description or call the phone number on screen for a free consultation with my team. Because you don't just need a legal team, you need the Eagle Team, especially these days. To bring a successful false arrest claim under the Fourth Amendment, a plaintiff has to show that they were intentionally detained without legal justification or probable cause. In Senator Padilla's case, video shows he was forcibly removed, physically restrained, and handcuffed by federal agents after attempting to ask a question at a DHS press conference. Now, that certainly looks like a seizure under the Fourth Amendment to me, which raises the question of whether the agents had a lawful basis for detaining him. And the government's justification hinges on the claim that Padilla was physically threatening Nome or failed to comply with lawful commands. However, as we talked about, the available footage appears to contradict the claims of the government.
I'm Senator Alex Padilla. I have questions for the Secretary.
Padilla had clearly identified himself as a U.S. Senator, and his tone, though forceful, I suppose, was not aggressive, and his body language did not appear threatening. It seems clear he did not lunge at Secretary Nome, and agents removed him without visibly issuing commands or warnings. And courts have repeatedly held that even brief detentions can amount to unconstitutional seizures if not supported by legal justification. The fact that Padilla's detention was relatively short does not necessarily make it lawful. What matters more is whether law enforcement had an objective basis to believe that Padilla had committed a crime or posed a genuine threat. And from the current record that we have, that seems doubtful. But what about the federal officers themselves? Some people have asked if the federal agents could face arrest by California law enforcement officers for what happened. And the answer depends on whether state law enforcement has jurisdiction. This was a federal building managed by the GSA, but most GSA-managed buildings fall under concurrent jurisdiction where both federal and state law enforcement have jurisdiction. And both federal and state law enforcement may have authority to investigate or arrest depending on the nature of the incident and the interagency agreements at play here. So it is possible that in theory that means the LAPD or state officers might be able to investigate or even arrest federal agents for alleged criminal acts against Padilla. But we would need to know more. And even if the property falls under concurrent jurisdiction, federal officers are generally immune from state arrest or prosecution when acting within the scope of their lawful federal authority. This principle was established in the case called LegalEagle, where the Supreme Court held that a U.S. Marshal could not be prosecuted under California law for actions taken to protect a Supreme Court justice because their conduct was authorized and necessary under federal law. But it also stands for the proposition that if they act outside of their scope and jurisdiction, or their deployment was illegal, that they could be arrested by state authorities. And given that there are a ton of federal agents and members of the military deployed to California whose authority and scope is extremely dubious, I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about LegalEagle in the near future. So federal immunity is not absolute. If a federal officer commits a crime outside of the scope of their official duties, then state and local law enforcement can have jurisdiction. Now finally, the FBI made the risible claim that Padilla's staffers could not record the events as of FBI rights.
There's no recording allowed out here. I did not know. There's no recording allowed out here.
But I guess someone needs to explain to these FBI agents that the US still has the most robust free speech protections in the world. In fact, we've made a whole video about your right to record the police. And here's a refresher. It is not illegal to record the police in public. The First Amendment protects your right to record matters of public interest, and that includes law enforcement activity. But of course, there are reasonable exceptions. You can't obstruct or interfere with police work or film in places where there would be an expectation of privacy. However, contrary to what people are saying on the internet, yes, there are regulations restricting where members of the public can make recordings. For example, 41 CFR 1002-74.420 is a general federal rule about recording in a GSA-controlled federal building. It says, quote, "What is the policy concerning photographs for news, advertising, or commercial purposes, except where security regulations, rules, orders, or directives apply, or a federal court order or rule prohibits it, persons entering in or on federal property may take photographs of A, space occupied by a tenant agency for non-commercial purposes, only with the permission of the occupying agency concerned, B, space occupied by a tenant agency for commercial purposes, only with written permission of an authorized official of the occupying agency concerned, and C, building entrances, lobbies, foyers, corridors, or auditoriums for news purposes." Now, Section C applies to public areas of GSA-controlled buildings, and Nome was presumably in a public briefing room, which by its nature is a public area where people are filming. She was giving a news conference, and I don't think any of these recordings are illegal. But no matter what the regulation says, I think in a matter of great news importance like this one, the First Amendment is going to protect the filming. But given that we have so much video evidence of this, it's particularly interesting to see how the media is covering this. Over 700 sources are reporting, with about 34% of the reporting coming from the left, 43% from the center, and only 23% coming from the right. And when you examine the different headlines, you see some very different frames emerge that shape how readers interpret and understand this potentially historic event. From the right, headlines typically emphasize Padilla's removal from the press conference as a consequence of him crashing or interrupting the DHS press conference. Headlines from the left-leaning sources tend to frame the story as a suppression of democracy, and sources reporting from the center gravitated towards frames that focus on the reactions from Democrats and Republicans rather than taking a clear editorial position, which is its own form of bias. But the headlines you read first have immense power to shape how you understand the news, and that's why I like to see the news from as many angles as I can, which I do with the help of today's sponsor, Ground News. Ground News is a website and app developed by a former NASA engineer on a mission to give readers an easy, data-driven, objective way to read the news. And right now they're offering Legal Eaglets 40% off their unlimited access Vantage subscription. You can scan the QR code or use the link in the description to get the discount for a limited time. Or simply download the Ground News mobile app and enter LegalEagle, all one word, as the discount code. Because Ground News gathers related articles from around the world and across the political spectrum, so you can see the bias and compare coverage. Every story comes with a quick visual breakdown of the political bias, factuality, and ownership of the source's reporting, all backed by ratings from 3 independent news monitoring organizations. One of my favorite parts is their bias comparison feature, which highlights specific differences in reporting across the political spectrum. This can be especially helpful when reading stories from sources you've never heard of, where there's no telling who owns it or what agenda they might have. I also love their blind spot feature, which shows you stories that are underreported by either side of the political spectrum. Because when big stories like the detention of Senator Padilla break, media outlets have to make decisions about what other news stories to cut, and those decisions often reflect partisan bias. Consider the story of a judge blocking Trump's executive order on requiring voters to present government-issued ID. That story was mostly ignored by right-leaning outlets, representing only 10% of sources reporting. But this type of analysis helps explain why we often talk past each other, and why some people seem hyper-focused on what seems like nonsense or fake news to others. But Ground News is my favorite way to get the news, and as a Legal Eaglet, you can save 40% off their Ground News Vantage subscription by scanning the code on screen or clicking on the link down below. The subscription gives you unlimited access to every feature, including the Bias Insight tool and blind spot feed. And by subscribing, you'll support an independent news platform working to make the media landscape more transparent. So click on the link below or scan the code today. After that, click on this link over here for more Legal Eagle, or I'll see you in court.